Hello and welcome. My name's Dan Hummel, and I'm on staff here at Upper House, a Christian study center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you're a regular Upper House attendee, you'll notice a significant graphical and set upgrade for this event. We're excited to be leaning into the new virtual event space, and I'm excited to welcome our two guests in just a moment. The conversation we're about to have has been in the works for quite a while. We'd initially intended this event to be hosted at Upper House on a Saturday morning, to give it the feel of a book festival or a sci-fi convention. Once we moved it online, we decided to keep some of the fixtures of that, including the timing on a Saturday, while reimagining other parts. We're going to have two one-hour sessions, the one now, and then after a half-hour break, another beginning at 10:30. At 11:30, all four panelists and I will move to a Zoom meeting room, where you can join and converse face-to-face, and then we'll finish right around noon. We at Upper House try to support the artists and writers in our community in Madison and to make the case to our broader community that a Christian faith without appreciation of beauty and imagination is a faith only half alive. Too many Christians see fiction and genres like science fiction as disconnected from not only their faith, but from the big questions of life. Questions of what it means to be human, what it means to pursue justice, and to have hope. As a genre that ponders these big questions from different creative angles, science fiction can help Christians see the familiar in a new light. I like the quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, that fiction reveals the truth reality obscures. This event is titled Science Fiction and Christian Hope. Science fiction might be self-explanatory, but Christian hope requires more. Christians are called to hope throughout the Bible. The definition of faith in Hebrews 11 is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. The psalmist in Psalm 75 cries out, "For you, O Lord, are my hope, my trust, O Lord, from my youth." And Paul gets at the eschatological hope of the resurrection when he describes Christ subjecting creation in hope that creation itself will be set free from bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. All of these invocations to hope point to different longings in the story of the Bible, different expectations and promises that touch individuals, communities, and the entire cosmos. Rather than prescribing a specific definition of Christian hope in this conversation, we'll explore how our panelists understand hope and how hope helps them shape their stories and worlds of science fiction. So with that, let me introduce my two guests for this conversation. First is Maurice Bratis. He's a teacher, community organizer, and author from Indianapolis. He's been widely published and to much acclaim. One of his more recent works in science fiction is Pimp My Airship, a steampunk novel set in an alternate reality Indianapolis. In terms of sci-fi related work, other sci-fi related work that Maurice has done, I should also mention that he has numerous other novels. He's written for the Firefly role-playing game and consulted on the video game Watch Dogs 2. So Maurice, welcome. And secondly, LaShawn Wanak is a science fiction, fantasy, and horror author who lives here in Madison. Her short stories have been published widely, and her novelette appeared in the 2019 Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy anthology called Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Memphis Minnie Sing the Stumps Down Good. She is the editor of the online science fiction and fantasy magazine Giganotosaurus and a book reviewer for Lightspeed magazine. Welcome, LaShawn. I should also mention we're going to have our Q&A open right now, and if you have any questions you're coming in with or questions that sort of come up during our conversation, please use the Q&A function, and the last few minutes of our time this hour will be spent answering questions from you. So with that, let's get started. I wanted to foreground this conversation with just some biography from both of you, get a sense of where you're coming from. So LaShawn, we'll start with you. Just give us a sense of who you are, what drives you as a writer, and why you chose to write science fiction as sort of one of the types of fiction that you write.
Thanks, Dan. I grew up with a grandmother who loved to read. So, and apparently that bug was passed on to me. I started reading when I was 4 years old, and would read books that were far beyond my grade bracket. So I think when I was 6 years old, I was reading adult books. And one of the things that my grandma, both my grandpa and my grandma subscribed to was Omni magazine, which was a science fiction and fantasy magazine in the 70s. And it had these gorgeous pictures, but then I started reading the stories, and the stories were just amazing. And that's how I first fell in love with fantasy and science fiction. So, and just growing up, I just realized it was a genre that I deeply loved. I loved how it stretched the imagination, and yeah, I didn't realize it at the time, but I wanted to write stories like that. It took me a while to realize that I wanted to be a writer, but once I did, I dove into it like both feet, and have been doing it ever since.
When did you start writing? Like, when was your first sort of consistent time where you would start calling yourself a writer or something like
Oh
that?
gosh. So when I was 12 years old, my grandma gave me a typewriter. And that's when I started like hashing out stories. They never really were finished stories. And it also wasn't really, I was too intimidated to do fantasy and science fiction at the time. So I wrote what I was reading, which was a lot of Victorian fiction. So a lot of English people riding horses in dank Scotland and things like that. And they were all white. So, but it wasn't until college that I started thinking, you know what, I can write fantasy. And that started the idea of writing in that genre with Black characters. It took me a long time to figure out how. But I'm happy to say that I just finished the last edits to that novel that started in college, and just sent it off to my agent yesterday. So
That's awesome.
it might be coming soon.
Yeah,
You might be seeing it.
congratulations. Yeah, that's awesome. Maurice, what about you? Give us just a sense of who you are, and what sort of animates you as a writer.
Okay, so so I actually came up much like LaShawn. I came up as a horror writer, and I came up as a horror writer. So these two stories are kind of intertwined. So I came up as a horror writer, and yet I also grew up in conservative evangelical church, in a conservative evangelical church. And so for me, horror was a way for me to process my anger and my theology. So because of the language of the genre and the tropes of the genre, I get to deal with, what is the reality of evil? What is nature of injustice? I get to wrestle with why do bad things happen? So keep that in mind. And then it becomes pretty easy to see, how often I was kicked out of Sunday school class. So this one time in Sunday school class, let's see, I think I was in 4th grade at the time, and the teacher had just told the story about Noah's Ark. And then she invited the class to come up, and is it in the old flannel graph days? So she invited everyone to come put these felt animals into Noah's Ark. So all my other classmates went and put, here's the giraffe, here's the lion, and then I went and I took bodies and laid them on top of the water. And I'm like, this is the story you just told us, right? So everybody else is like dead and floating on the water, right? And so I was kicked out of class. But another Sunday school teacher kind of, adopted me under his wing and everything. He was just like, all right, we can't do that, but I think you're secretly one of us. And I'm like, what do you mean one of us? And so he invited me over to his house one day, and then he shows me his collection of like Stephen King novels and Doctor Who videotapes and X-Men comic books. And suddenly I was like, oh, I finally have a place to fit in, because I knew I was drawn to these sort of stories. I just didn't know how it fit in with the rest of my world. And so I probably spent the first half of my career as a horror writer. And then the last, probably five to 10 years has been me, and I didn't even realize, I knew I with intentionality, I went into horror, but me drifting into fantasy and then science fiction, that I was just writing the stories that were on my heart at the time. My first trilogy was the Knights of Breton Court series, which was King Arthur, a retelling of the King Arthur stories, except set in Indianapolis, modern day Indianapolis. And then I graduated over to, well, graduated like this is a course or something. But anyway, I drifted into science fiction because that was, where the stories I was writing were coming from. And I didn't know why I was suddenly drawn to science fiction of all things. And then I realized that because I'm also the resident Afrofuturist at one of the community organizations I work for. And I realized that both of those missions come from the same place. I realized that my love of Afrofuturism ties in neatly with where my Christian walk is, which is that they both stem from this sense of a future hope. And so my science fiction is creating these worlds I would love to see, the worlds I want to exist, as well as creating roadmaps for, all right, so if that's where I want to be, how do I join in God's reconciliation work now to get to that point? So I see my writing and my community work as me just joining in God's reconciliation work.
That's fascinating, Maurice. That's you're anticipating a lot of where our conversation will go to, sort of exploring that in more detail. If I could just, I'll ask you first, Maurice. How would you describe your Christian faith now, and maybe if you can give a little more sense of just what you mean by Christian hope, what you just used, that term.
Oh, that's a big question. All right, so since my Christian faith now, so like I said, I grew up in evangelical circles. I left Christianity for a while. And actually I joined the Nation of Islam for a while. So I was a member of the Nation of Islam for a couple of years. I came back to Christianity, but I was just like, but I was always constantly searching, and then trying to add different, because since I grew up in one corner of Christianity, I wanted to see what is the breadth of my faith? What does that look like? So I studied Catholicism, I studied Eastern Orthodoxy, just to grapple with all the different elements of what the totality of Christianity means. And I actually was studying with Orthodoxy, where I realized that, well, part of what was missing in my faith and part of what I needed in my faith was this embrace of mystery. And so, and this whole being comfortable with the idea of mystery, and just to be able to say, hey, you know what? I don't know, as a comfortable part of my theology. And so that's, and what was, let me make sure I'm answering your question. What was the rest of your question?
Just, yeah, that's great. Interesting journey there. Just a little more about Christian hope. What is the sort of, what do you, when you hear that term, what comes to mind?
Well, honestly, it's just like, well, actually from my prayers this morning, to be honest, where it's, I'm wrestling with the injustice in the world. And the fact that it's like, there's very many systems that train me to not believe in justice anymore, period. And that's where I find myself a lot of the days. And I could stay in that space, but I believe in a God of justice. And so, so my future hope is actually a longing for that return, that sense of justice, that sense of setting the world right. So that is my Christian hope.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Maurice. LaShawn, same to you. How would you describe your faith today? And when you hear the term Christian hope, what comes to mind?
Okay, so I'm coming from a very different space with Maurice. So I grew up in the church, and I grew up in a charismatic faith. So so there was always that sense of mystery in growing up, in that sense of things unseen. When I moved to Madison about 12 years ago, I never thought that I would struggle with my faith. And I can actually honestly say that in this space that I am now, I'm struggling because things have happened within the past 10 years that have really challenged my faith. And it's been something that I never thought I would see. And I tend to use my writing a lot to explore that and to process that. But where Christian hope comes in is this year alone. This year alone is probably the biggest test. And there have been times when I honestly told God, I don't know you exist. We're all probably making this up. And this is, you know, we're basically not, as special as we think we'd be. And then something would happen. Something would happen. And it would be like, wait, Lord, was that you? And God, I believe God works through coincidences. I believe he works through people that you don't expect. And I think overall, it's not just the hope that there is a God, but a God who actually cares for us and loves us, and that we have that same ability within us to do that. I would define that as Christian hope. And right now, it's me finding out, okay, how do I live that out, kind of thing.
Well, thank you both for your honesty with that. That's I think it's great for the people watching to just see what it's like to be an artist and struggle with faith, and have art be really a arena to work out some of these big questions. And I think the honor of the rest of us is we get to read it, or we get to see it and engage with it on our own. So moving a little forward, and maybe zeroing in on science fiction. LaShawn, maybe you could speak to this first. How do you see science fiction being especially well suited to express themes of hope? Or do you, I mean, I assume you do, that's one of the genres you write in, but do you see sort of something built into the genre that helps you do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, Maurice had mentioned earlier about Afrofuturism, which is basically science fiction, imagining science fiction through a Black lens. So for the longest time, I actually saw the two of them as separate, like between Christian hope and Afrofuturism. So, and I couldn't really actually reconcile it at first, because with the Christian mindset, our hope is in Jesus, and therefore we say he's coming back again someday and all that. Whereas Afrofuturism tends to look more beyond that. It's like imagining Black people living and thriving in a world that is not hurtful for them. It took me a long time to actually reconcile the two. And that was actually part of the struggling process. Because I grew up with us saying, that Jesus is going to come back, and then there's going to be this happy utopia where there's no race and no war and no arguing and things like that. And when I started reading a lot more Afrofuturism, this was during the time of when Trayvon Martin got killed, when Eric Garner. I found myself reading a lot more Black fiction, and in particular Black science fiction writers. and realizing that that hope of seeing where Black people are existing in a space where they're not persecuted, this is something that God is wanting as far as justice goes. And it was, it kind of blew my mind. So yeah, it's that's how Afrofuturism, that's how God is working through Afrofuturism. Being able to imagine and thus create dignity for Black people.
Thanks, LaShawn. How about you, Maurice? How do you see science fiction well suited to express themes of hope?
Yeah, so it's along the same lines as LaShawn. I'm going to phrase it in terms of Afrofuturism versus Afropessimism, okay, which is the similar sort of conversation as saying utopia versus dystopia. And so, for a long time, I was drawn to dystopic stories. Because what I realized about dystopias is, yes, dystopias wrestle with how things appear to be now. The grim reality of the now, and so one of the strengths of dystopic works is that a lot of the stories end up being stories of resistance and stories of resilience, and I think that's the powerful draw of dystopian stories, and that's been a lot of that, with the sense of Afro-pessimism, that's been the outworking of that thought of, hey, what does it mean to no matter the circumstances, to be able to thrive no matter what. So there's that. But then there's the idea of Afrofuturism and the utopia, and that wellspring is from hope. Imagining ourselves into the future, or imagining ourselves into and so it's both, for me, Afrofuturism is about hope and it's about building towards something. Okay, and I think that's again, we're back to the tropes and language of the genre. I mean, this is absolutely suited to where I am in terms of my community work and where I am as a person and where I am in my Christian walk. So it's this idea of imagining how different systems could be. Because if we are to be working against the principalities of this world, if we were to be working against these systems, if we're to be countercultural, we have to have an imagination to be able to imagine different ways of being, different ways of relating, different ways of moving through the world, ways that prioritize humanity and our well-being. And I love it when LaShawn said dignity, the dignity of our humanness. Imagine if we had systems that centered that. What could that world look like? What could those systems look like? And then what sort of stories could we tell in that world? So that's the strength of it for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's hearing both of you talk, it's so clear that there's sort of an additional dimension to what sort of the classic sci-fi tropes of this sort of structural or system understanding of our world, of imagining different organizations of society, but actually getting into the systems that make societies just or unjust. I think that's just a fascinating sort of extra dimension to what maybe a lot of people think about when they think of science fiction world building even. Yeah, that's great. So maybe getting a little more into both of your own writings, there's some science fiction writing that represents Christianity in it. And I'm thinking of like the shepherd character in Firefly as a clergyman. But a lot more science fiction doesn't have explicit representations of Christian faith, but can still sort of touch on themes that would resonate with a Christian reader and writer. So what's the best ways you found to integrate faith themes into your work? And you can be as specific as you can talk about particular stories or pull back a little. But how do you sort of think about integrating those into the actual things you write? So Maurice, maybe we can start with you.
Okay. So now we're going back early into my writing journey a bit. As I was beginning my writing career, I mean, I always tell my students the hardest thing to do as an artist is to figure out what your voice is. what your artistic voice is. And so for me, I was wrestling with, all right, so what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Christian? And what does that mean for me in terms of my writing? And that was a question I wrestled with nonstop. And and then here's the irony. It was me reading a novel by Stephen King that showed me how to integrate my spirituality into my work more. He had a book called Desperation, and the whole theme of the book is you're either in a state of faith or you're in a state of desperation. And it was told through the point of view of this young boy who had this vibrant and very real Christian faith, and then how he uses that faith to combat the evil that his family is then confronted with. And just watch it, and I could tell from reading the book, it's like, wait, Stephen King is really wrestling with questions of faith at a very fundamental level. And as I've read a lot of his work, I keep coming back to this idea of he continues to wrestle with faith in the background of a lot of his stories. And then it occurred to me that you know what, that's it. If I'm writing from that place of my own genuine wrestling with faith, if I'm writing from just a sense of who I am, so I'm not there to proselytize, but I am there to work things out. And if I'm working things out, that is the journey of humanity. And that very human story is something that people can relate to no matter what their faith is. I ended up doing a project called Dark Faith for Apex Books. And all I did was invite people from across the genre spectrum to write stories that turned on the idea of faith, whatever the idea of faith meant to them. And so I end up, and again, this is just me working out, my own spiritual journey, but it's like, hey, well, I bet you I'm not the only one who's wrestling with these sort of things. And to see my friends from across religious spectrum, so I mean, my atheist friends, my Wiccan friends, my Buddhist friends, to watch them, say, hey, you know what, here's how I've been wrestling with faith. And then put together that project was really eye-opening. And to find out how many of my atheist friends were like, hey, can I write for it too? That sort of incitement of like, hey, just, we don't believe, but there's a reason why, and here are the things that we're wrestling with. And so I welcomed all those stories. And I think that very wrestling of faith and the wrestling of spiritual issues is part of what makes us human. So now we fast forward to, actually some stories I wrote just a year or so ago. I had a novella come out in Beneath Ceaseless Skies called Ella's a Spaceship Melody. And yes, it was an excuse for me to see if I could build a world where I could have a starship powered by jazz music. So that was one thing I wanted to accomplish. And so that was part of my world building. But one of the subplots of the novella was this whole idea of, so there's an AI system that runs the ship. And so it's like, at what point could an artificial intelligence become so aware and achieve such a level of consciousness that it might wrestle with spiritual ideas, that it might wrestle with like, wait, do I have a soul? Are you my creator? Should I be worshiping you? So the AI starts asking these questions. And so, so my very real wrestling with faith, my very real living out that faith as I understand it in the moment, plays out in my stories. So that's how I integrate it.
That's fascinating. And moving toward the sort of universal struggle of faith really makes total sense. As you were talking, LaShawn held up the Dark Faith book, so that we can probably plug that in the chat as well. LaShawn, how about you? How do you think about integrating these themes of faith and hope into your writing?
Kind of short answer, I do it pretty much all the time, because I grew up with science fiction and fantasy, and actually a lot of science fiction in particular do wrestle with those big themes. So I'm used to it. For me, when I first started actually writing, I was like, okay, I'm going to become the next C.S. Lewis or the next Madeleine L'Engle. I'm going to see how I'm going to pull those in. And come to I think sometime early in my writing career when I started intentionally writing, realizing that I couldn't do it because their faith was so different. The way their faith and their faith journey was a whole lot different from mine. Like I said, I grew up in a very charismatic Black church. I grew up among evangelical, when I came to college, I grew up among, evangelical folk who had very diverse ideas. And it took me a very long time to figure out, okay, I can't write all sunshine and roses because I also have friends who are going through some very dark times. And then the whole Black Lives Matter movement started. And that was when I was like, I pretty much realized at some point that whatever Christian writing I would write would not be recognizable by the evangelical church. So I was like, okay, I'm going to abandon it. What exactly am I going to write that reflects my questions and my struggles and also my hope. And there was a period of time back in 2016 where I was seriously wrestling with a lot of issues. It was a very bad year, 2016. Very, very, very bad year. And it was the first time that my faith was seriously challenged. And so I decided I'm going to sit down and try and figure out and write out what exactly am I wrestling with. So I have about a year ago before that, I had learned about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who is an actual musician. She was a black guitarist in the 30s and 40s who played guitar and sang gospel songs and was absolutely amazing. And I was like, holy cow. When I first learned of her, I was like, I want to put her in the story. And then I learned about Memphis Minnie, who was in that same genre, but she was in blues. And I was like, there was a moment where they both lived in Chicago, but there was never actually any evidence that they knew about each other. So I was like, what would be a story that would actually take the two of them and have them meeting? And that was how Sister Miss Rosetta Tharpe and Memphis Minnie Sing the Stumps started coming together. And as I did research into their lives, one of the things that I learned was that Rosetta was a very strong Christian. She thought that her gift was basically bringing gospel to the world through her music. Whereas Memphis Minnie was not. She was a very strong, she was really rough, and she had a very rough life. And so I was able to actually figure out things through the two women on the whole nature of faith, because what it boiled down to was their relationship, and trying to just writing about the relationship and the tensions between the two. There's a scene where Rosetta tries to tell Minnie she's broken, and things like that, and Minnie reacts because it's like this is stuff that she grew up with all her life, and and basically Christians didn't care about her. And I was wrestling with those same feelings, like, do we actually care about people, or are we trying to quote make check marks on we saved this person so they can get into heaven, we're done kind of thing. And it just became this gorgeous, beautiful story of these two women's relationship with each other, and also playing guitars to kick butt and kick evil. So yeah, Yeah, I that's how I still process things through writing, and that's how I'm going to do it. And I'll be my own person in that.
One thing that I've noticed from both of your writings is your use of history as a way to think through history, and then merging it with science fiction as a way to sort of get at some of these themes as well, which I think is certainly something other people do as well, but it's something both of you do really well in your work. So I appreciate that sort of way to get at and doing actual historical research, like you, LaShawn, just talked about, into people's lives, and finding, you know, the themes that you'll write about in that historical research as well. Okay, we just have a few more minutes. I do want to remind you, if you have questions for LaShawn, Maurice, we're going to head to those in just a couple minutes. I see a few of you are already writing questions. I have two more questions. The first one being, and we touched on this a little, but maybe we can talk about it a little more. I think part of the interest in science fiction in recent years seems to be because our actual future seems very cloudy or bleak, and never more so than in 2020. And so one of my theories maybe is that science fiction is appealing to people because it helps them get a sense of what a future could be, or maybe in maybe more hard sci-fi, what a future will be, you know, in some sort of more material sense. But Maurice, we'll go to you first. How do you think science fiction plays a role in helping people develop a sense of the future, and how do you hope your science fiction gives people hope?
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about two of my projects then. The first is going to be Pimp My Airship, which I, I love that title, and
Yeah.
I love the settings I get to talk about that title in. Always makes me laugh. And so part of Pimp My Airship is that it takes place in this alternate history version of Indianapolis that details out the actually very real history of Indianapolis, how Indianapolis was built, and a lot of the foundations that put the systems into place for Indianapolis. So all that history is actually very real, including the fact that in the 20s and 30s, like one in three people in Indiana were open members of the Klan. And that goes into the foundation of the building of Indiana and Indianapolis specifically. So, you know, so I have that and use that very real history to create this world. But the main thrust of the story was a question that I was wrestling with personally, which is, you know, I am just a writer. But if I'm called to join in God's mission of reconciliation, what does that look like? And so the main plot of Pimp My Airship is this follows the adventures of I have three characters, but one of them, his name is Sleepy. He's a poet, and it's about his journey of awakening to the world that's around him, and then how does he use his gifts and talents to leverage change to make his community and the world a better place. And so that's the whole journey of Pimp My Airship. So it starts with here's the history that brought us to this point. What is our responsibility in that moment? Okay, so that's the first half. The second half is I'm currently working on a new trilogy. It's a science fiction trilogy called All the Stars, which thinks through what an intergalactic Black empire might look like. Mm-hmm. And part of that is, like I was talking about earlier, what does it look like to rethink systems? What is so it's like, all right, so I'm a science fiction writer. You know, I'm a consultant on all these projects. Well, I'm a consultant because I come at things in a different way, and and I'm a big idea thinker. Well, all right, let's put it to the test. All right, if you were called to rebuild education or economics or all these other different systems, how we govern ourselves, that sort of thing. All right, what could that look like? And so I've probably spent a year and a half thinking through that and doing the world building for this series. And I have a bunch of stories that take. As a matter of fact, Ella's Spaceship Melody is one of the stories that actually is in this universe, because I'm experimenting with, all right, how could we do things differently, and what could that look like? And then casting these sort of visions, of possible futures. How can we start creating roadmaps now that help us along the way to get to those sort of states? How can we figure out ways to be with one another better and just, muddle through life together better? So that's how it shaped out.
Yeah, really looking forward to that trilogy, Maurice. That sounds awesome.
Thank you.
LaShawn, how about you? How do you hope your fiction can give people a sense of a hopeful future?
I'm more on the relationship building in my stories, because I think that's how God ministers to people, is through relationships. And it's something that I've actually started exploring more. For me, one of the things that I asked myself when I actually started writing more professionally was how on the one hand, I'm writing to process things and process my own feelings about Christianity and all that, but how can God use my writing, as a way to reach out to people who, and minister to them? Because I think that's one of the reasons why I also write, is to also like to touch people and go, oh yeah, I feel that way too, kind of thing. And it's something that I'm trying to be more intentional about, whether it is, writing just goofy stuff, about superheroes, or I wrote a little, like, a flash story for this audio magazine called Podcastle some years ago, that had to do with superheroes and all that. But one of the biggest things that within the past several years that I have been trying to figure out is not just touching, the Black community, but also reaching out to the LGBTQ a community, and trying to bring that into my fiction as well, and reaching out to them and ministering to them and saying, hey, you also have, you are also precious in God's sight. You are also loved, and ministering to that. So I tend to uplift a lot of LGBTQ science fiction writers, and there's a huge amount of them coming out right now. They're writing stories that are just mind blowing, and through that, I believe through their stories, that takes away that sense of other, which is something that is so pervasive in our world right now. Because when you tell a story from your own experience to another person, you get to share that. You share that part of yourself that is, it's a vulnerable space, but it's also, a space where that gives the reader to say, hey, I can connect with that. I can go with that. And with those, with the themes, especially within science fiction, it helps you get a sense of who the writer is and what they stand for. So that's why I tell people, when you read science fiction, don't just stick in, with one little genre. Expand, because like there's so many good stories out there right now, and they're written from actually, honest to good people who will, who have just the same faults as you, the same needs as you, and they even have the same hope. It may not look like ours, but they have hope. So, yeah.
Thanks, LaShawn. It's just fascinating to see how both of you approach that question in different systems and relationships. I don't think those are totally opposed either, but they're just two different ways to get at the same sort of end goal, I guess. I just want to ask one quick question at the end here, and then we'll jump to Q&A. And that's for each of you to just recommend someone in your world, someone you hope more people read, that you think exemplifies this in their own writing, sort of the hope theme, the theme of giving us something to think about for a hopeful future. So if maybe LaShawn, you can go first, and then Maurice.
Okay, so yeah, I have a stack of books here because we're in my house right now, and this is my library. So just now I talked about I'll hold this book up. So this is Charlie Jane Anders. Charlie Jane Anders is a science fiction writer who is amazing at writing hope. Her stories are just, they get you, and they get you so hard in places that you can't even fathom you have. and she would probably blush if I say that. Charlie Jane Anders is a trans person who she most of her stories are science fiction. This is probably one of the stories that she was best known for, The City in the Middle of the Night. She's now working on YA, but I highly suggest you pick up a lot of her work because, yeah, her writing is gorgeous and devastating. So, and that's just one person.
Thank you. Thanks, LaShawn. How about you, Maurice?
Let's see. Well, because I was thinking about this, and again, like I said, my brain starts off with the Afro-pessimism, the dystopian stories at first, oddly enough, and so for me in that lens, what came to mind was An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon, and Parable of the Sower, which just hit the New York Times bestseller list 27 years after it first came out, by Octavia Butler. And then in terms of hope, one of the stories that one of the novels that really hit home for me in terms of in terms of Christian searching for or wrestling with their faith was a story called The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, and it involves an interstellar missionary trip, and it's just the importance of understanding culture and understanding language when it comes to living out your faith. Actually, a lot of missionary starship stories sprang to mind because Leviathan Waits from the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey, or Planetfall by Emma Newman. You see this wrestling of missionary trips on an intergalactic level. So those probably be the ones that spring to mind right off.
That's great. Thank you, Maurice. We will move here into just a few Q&A from the audience. We want to end right around 10 so that we can reset here for session 2 after that. The first question to come in, and I think this is an interesting one based on where our conversation went, is from an anonymous person. What writers had an influence on you with respect to Afrofuturism? Where do you recommend starting with this genre if you're unfamiliar with it? Either you want to take that?
Sure. You want to go, LaShawn, or I can jump in?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Right.
So, yes, I have this ready. So N.K. Jemisin is a great person to start with. She has just been amazing. So this is the book 1 of her Broken Earth series. It's 3 books that are just, oh my gosh.
Game changing.
Yeah, game changing. Yeah, yeah. So what's I would say right now we're going through this lovely little golden age of Black authors just coming out and just writing these awesome stories. And N.K. Jemisin is just one of them. The way that she writes is just, Oh my gosh, it's take over, Maurice. Take over.
Well, it's interesting because I was talking to an editor, and he even said, you know, for a long time, the golden age, we've been living in the age of Tolkien, and he goes, but right now we're experiencing the age of Jemison, because this is the Broken Earth trilogy was her second trilogy, and she had a duology before that, and now she's in the middle of another trilogy. And when I say she's a game-changing author, you know, I like to believe that I'm pretty good at world building, but she's who I go to study when it comes to world building.
Mm-hmm.
Two other authors that have influenced me a lot. One I've mentioned, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, and that's one of the standard starting place for a lot of folks when it comes to Afrofuturism. And then for me, the other major influence on me is actually Walter Mosley, who's known more as a crime writer, but he wrote this sci-fi novel. Well, it's 9 interconnected short stories called Futureland, and that had a profound influence on me as a writer. And I think that's what actually sent me careening into science fiction. Was I bumped into that book, and then, you know, that had me forever changed in terms of, man, what could I do? Science fiction lets me do a whole lot of things I didn't think that were possible. And so Futureland opened my eyes to a lot of possibilities for the genre.
For me, yep. Yeah, and coming back to me, so N.K. Jemisin has been a huge influence on me. As far as the fantasy side goes, because I actually write a lot more fantasy than I do science fiction, Neil Gaiman has had a huge, profound, his work has been hugely profounding for me. And I discovered him actually through a staff worker for university who exposed me to his graphic novels. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is completely mind-blowing. And so, I've been a huge Neil Gaiman fan and just been inspired by his work, but also the way that he integrates sort of story, like fairy tales and folklore. I've actually endeavored to try and do that with my own writing. And the book that I just finished now, that hopefully one day will get picked up, is a fantasy novel, but also deals with a lot of folklore and things like that. So.
Great, thanks, LaShawn. The book you were holding up was, I think, American Gods. Is that the
American Gods?
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely no spiritual themes in that book.
No.
Okay, we're going to have one more question here, a little more on the theology side. And then just to let everyone know, we're going to take a break and then go to session 2. But we're going to have at 11:30 Central Time a half-hour just a Zoom meeting where everyone can have their video on, and it can be sort of like if you were able to talk to the panelists after a panel at a convention or something. So make sure if you have a burning question to come there, and we'll have more time there. John Ball asks, he says, I think we're often so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good because we have no imagination of life after Jesus returns to earth, the new earth that Jesus will create. Do you think the question of new creation can be tackled by sci-fi or fantasy? And I think John's obviously talking about a particular Christian understanding of what happens when Jesus comes back and all that. It's sort of eschatology. But I think that's a prevalent view among particularly evangelicals in America. So what do you think about that? What do you think about that concept of new creation and how science fiction can explore that?
Yeah, so I grew up with it. Well, not grew up with it. No, I grew up with it. Yeah, and it was probably also more, it was probably one of the reasons why growing up, so I'm going to share a quick story. When I was reading science fiction when I was a kid, I was teased about it a lot at church because it's like, it's not real. Why would you want to read that and things like that? It's like it's imagining a future without Jesus and things like that. So yeah, but for me, I always saw them as stories anyway. I never actually considered that we can actually imagine a future, like in the future. And it actually wasn't until I read a book by Andy, is it Andy Crouch? I forget the name. It's something culture.
Culture
I actually
making
have it.
or culture making, was that the
Culture making, and he actually tackles that that belief and actually imagines what a Christian what a world would look like. And so I actually read that before the whole I read that before I started seriously thinking about Afrofuturism and thinking, okay, and it's probably why I have not written that much science fiction, because I had to wrestle with that belief in myself. And it's only within the past few years that I've thought, okay, what would it look like to be in a world, maybe 5,000 years in the future? What would that look like? And asking myself really hard questions. What happens? What if Jesus hasn't come back at that time? What does that look like? And it's actually a story that I'm sort of germinating on right now, and thinking, and then me thinking, rethinking. Okay, what does Jesus's words, "The kingdom is here"? What does that mean? And just thinking and ruminating and meditating on those words. And it's like, well, it's kind of looking a lot like what we are now, but and sorry, now I'm just spouting out words, but it's something I am still thinking about. Let me put it that way.
And I can actually pick up from that very point right there, because I was reading James Cone, God of the Oppressed, and he said, to hope in Jesus is to see the vision of his coming presence, and thus one is required by hope itself to live as if the vision is already realized in the present.
Mm.
And so that's always been the springboard for my writing. And so when I set off to write this this Afrofuturist tale, I mean, like LaShawn, I was like, oh, so what could life be like 5,000 years from now? And then I'm like, yeah, I can't think 5,000 years from now. I'm thinking maybe 1,000 years from now. And I'm like, all the things I'm thinking of, that might actually only be a couple hundred years from now. So I guess my story is only a couple hundred years from now. And then that even shortened. And then, and in that moment I go, Jesus, you ain't back yet? All right, if you're not back yet, then all right, so I guess we're going to try and do this. What does the world look like with us still trying to do it on our own terms, which is ultimately what life is in a lot of ways. It's like, all right, well, if Jesus isn't back, well, what, so it's a combination of how are we joining in that work to reconcile and to create new world, new heavens, new earth. But again, then wrestling with the reality of, well, Jesus isn't back yet. So that means there's a whole lot of fallen systems still in play. And so how do these two ideas now work against each other? And I found that that's pretty much where I'm sitting with right now.
That's great. Thank you for.
Go on. Sorry.
No, LaShawn, you'll have the last word here. What did you want to continue?
No, actually, I was going to say, yeah, at that point, then it ties into what I really love about reading science fiction as a whole, because yeah, it's wrestling about stuff that happens in the future, but it's dealing with things that are happening now. And if Jesus is supposed to be with us and among us, it should not be two separate ideas. God will come, but God is already here and he is working in our lives. And this is something that should be present no matter where we go. And so our question is, how then do we respond to that? And that will happen whether it is now or is 5,000 years from now. Yeah.
Thanks, LaShawn.
And
That's a
ask
great.
Christian help.
Yeah, there you go. That's a great closing word for this session. Thank you both. This has been a really stimulating conversation.